From across time and space and throughout the multiverse, listen as multiple generations of geeks come together to discuss the iconic characters, events, and franchises that make up the very fabric of pop culture as we know it. Let Your Geek Side Show presents Then and Now. Hey there, this is Kitty. Then and Now is taking a small break right now, but we thought you might be interested in our episode all about Marvel's X-Men. While they've been the underdogs since their inception, there's no denying that in recent years they've seen a resurgence not only in popularity, but in power across the Marvel Universe. My guest Katie and I sat down in the middle of Jonathan Hickman's groundbreaking House of X, Powers of 10 comic book series to discuss the days of future past and the futures yet to come for everyone's favorite mutants. This is X-Men Then and Now. All right, so Katie, thank you for joining me this week.
This is super awesome. I'm really excited.
I wish you guys could see, but Katie is completely dressed for the occasion. She's got an X-Men hat, Wolverine shirt, and some earrings. She jumped at the chance to come do this, and so we are actually really excited. I know we've covered some X-Men characters before in the podcast. I know we did a Jean Grey one previously, but this one we're actually talking about the X-Men as a franchise, not just a team of people, like the actual entire history, as much as we can, of the X-Men franchise and how it continues to evolve.
Which is really exciting. A lot of it I'm still learning, so it's really neat for me. I grew up in a family where comics weren't really a big deal, so It was the occasional when I got to watch cartoons, and so then, playing with my cousins, and then becoming an adult and checking out the comic books, and now it's like, I need everything.
Yeah, no, I totally feel that. I'm actually pretty recent to the X-Men myself. I always found it to be really intimidating, and I actually came into comics at a time they were kind of downplaying the X-Men because the movie rights weren't at the House of Mouse yet with the MCU. So I didn't really know where to jump in. I feel like I missed a formative part of my childhood years because a lot of people cite X-Men the Animated Series as kind of their inspiration to get into the X-Men universe.
That was absolutely where I got started. We love that show. I loved it as a kid. I would love to go just sit and binge watch it again. It's so much fun. Mm-hmm. I don't really know too many people who don't like it. And it's kind of great because then that inspired kids playing the X-Men.
Yeah.
And, I definitely did that myself. And my go-to was Storm because I love, who doesn't want to have powers to control the weather and fly? It just seems super fun.
Yeah. Especially the costumes from that era are kind of some of the most cherished as well, because that era almost went hand in hand with the kind of Jim Lee launch of the X-Men. Of course, you got that 4-cover spread of them all taking down Magneto or trying to take down Magneto. But a lot of X-Men fandom is really synonymous with that 90s imagery, which I think is really cool.
It is really exciting. And then to sort of pick your favorite characters and sort of see what happens with them is really neat. I would say my favorites as a kid are not the same as my favorites as an adult. And
really?
I've gotten more into Magneto, and I absolutely love the Juggernaut. So he is one of my favorites, and he's not actually technically a mutant. So that's what's kind of cool about him. And I didn't even learn that until, a couple weeks ago. And I just I love the Juggernaut. And I have to be honest, I absolutely loved Vinnie Jones playing the Juggernaut because I think he's fantastic. So that was really fun for me.
Excellent. Yeah, there have been so many depictions of, a lot of them are the same kind of core characters that show up time and time again on screen because they are our favorite ones. And a lot of them are the ones that kind of came about in the Claremont and Byrne era. Because, obviously we have the ones that were the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, first class, original characters. But the Claremont and Byrne era, I'm thinking giant size X-Men #1, that cover, and everyone's just bursting through. It does surprise a lot of people to learn that Wolverine was not there from the start. That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. I'm also really thrilled that they've been doing reprints of those first key issues because while I am a collector, I don't necessarily have the funds to spend on the X-Men #1, and Colossus is another favorite, and Giant Size X-Men #1 understandably is an expensive issue, but I can't really justify spending X amount, whatever it's being offered for, X amount to get it in my collection. But when they do these reprints, it really does let collectors grab these issues that they may not be able to get at some point. You know, obviously I still think it's something on my wish list, but with Colossus being a favorite, I need Giant Size X-Men #1 because that's where he shows up, and that's his first appearance. And, you know, I grabbed the reprint of the very first X-Men, and to see the difference between Bobby Drake in X-Men #1 and Bobby Drake now is a huge difference.
Yeah.
And even Jean Grey and some of the, and it was, you know, the sort of all the men going after Jean, and then it's sort of like fun to see how it started and then watch it evolve.
Oh, absolutely, because the name of the game with X-Men is evolution, and they are the Homo superior. The name of the game is change. When you brought up all the guys going after Jean, Hasbro recently put out a 3-pack of the 90s themed with Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops, and someone posted it on Twitter with the caption, "This box just sighed at me and said it's complicated." And like, it was so, I thought that was so funny. But as a collector as well, like, there's some of those issues where it's like, I will never get my hands on this because it is so scarce and so expensive. But Marvel does a good job with the reprints, because you want to still be able to read those stories. Because even if you got your copy of Giant Size X-Men, if you wanted to even read the story, it would be like gloves and tweezers style. Like, so the fact that they make these cheaper reprints is a really nice way to let fans know that these stories are still accessible. Like, especially with the X-Men, because they're always a team for championing the underdog. Like, the X-Men are the ultimate underdogs, and I think in that, more recent years have explored a really interesting thing, that there are some X-Men whose powers are more glamorous than the others. I remember when I worked at a comic book store, there was a series called The Worst X-Men Ever. And it went through explaining a young boy who was identified as having the X gene, but he wasn't sure what his power was. And Beast, I believe it was, actually found out what his power was. And arguably, yes, this is the worst X-Men power. He has the power to explode, but only one time. And after that, that's it. But I think that after kind of the Claremont Byrne era and some of the mutants started to get more popular, the writers and artists did identify the fact that, like, yeah, some of the mutations suck. Like, they really just suck. And that's where we have the Morlocks who hide in the sewers, and then we've got characters like Skin and Maggot and Husk, whose powers are all disgusting and weird, but they still get a chance to be on teams like Generation X and all these. The fact that any mutant, no matter the power, can have a chance to be a hero,
which is really neat to show both the bad and the good. And then you just kind of have the Strange, like one of my favorite, the Dazzler.
Oh, I love her.
And she gets taken over at one point, and then she's actually hurting people. And they realize, and what I like is, so I've been trying to get the brief history compacted. So if you're looking for a really great starting point to see if the X-Men is for you, the Grand Design series is fantastic. It starts at the very, very beginning with the start of Professor Xavier and Magneto and sort of their stories. And you'll see that they do really line up with everything. And then it brings you up through the beginning of the X-Men and just keeps going throughout their whole history. And it's really great because it will also tell you what the key issues are that they're referencing in the back.
Oh, that's always helpful.
So if you're looking for something like, they bring up the fact that Namor destroyed New York, they tell you which episode or which issues he appears in X-Men with that.
Oh, wow.
So it's really useful, especially if you collect more than one thing and you know that who you're looking for is in the X-Men. They may be able to tell you those issues in there as well.
So that's not only a compacted, like, 40-year history of the X-Men, but it's also like a handy-dandy collector guide for, like, if you want to learn a little bit more, go to these other books.
I think that's a good assessment. Yeah. So it's great to see, because I don't know. I know some, but I would like to know more, and at least getting the overarching ideas so you can sort of see things going. And I actually think it's useful for me, at least, with the new series, the House of X and Powers of 10, because it gives a bit more background to what's going on. Because I'll admit I'm a little confused, but I think I'm figuring it out. So it's great to have more of a frame of reference of the history leading up to that point. Because a lot of the characters they introduce in those that I did particularly remember are also in the grand design, and it kind of gives you their background to know what's going on.
Awesome. And I correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was art and writing by Ed Piskor from, I know he did Hip Hop Family Tree, but I'm not sure if he's the writer and the artist on the series.
I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
I'm terrible at remembering those names.
Should be enough information for someone to go to the comic book store, though, and hit them up.
So, yeah, there's 6 total comics. There's the X-Men Grand Design, X-Men Grand Design Genesis, and then Extermination Grand Design. I accidentally started with the first one and the last one and was like, this doesn't make any sense. Then I looked and realized, oh, right, because that's not the one you're supposed to start with.
Okay. Before we go any further, because you did mention the newest Marvel Comics event, which is, as my friends all call it in abbreviation, Hoxpox, but it's House of X and Powers of 10, even though the X in that case does stand for 10. There will be maybe brief spoilers if you're not caught up. It is a weekly series that is moving pretty quickly. But for the uninitiated, as I said, or maybe I didn't say, maybe I just thought about it. I came into the Marvel Comics universe in the kind of Marvel Now era in about 2011, 12. That's when I seriously started picking up monthly books. And at that time, they were really downplaying the X-Men because the movie rights didn't belong to Marvel Studios, and they were downplaying the Fantastic Four, and a lot of people were kind of concerned about that. But fast forward to now, and Jonathan Hickman, who I think the last thing he did for Marvel was the Secret Wars comic in 2015. That's also a running joke in this podcast. I always try to bring up Secret Wars at any given instant because the 2015 version of that story was hugely formative for what's going on now. But he came back and he said, hey, Marvel, I got a pitch for you, and this is my plan to kind of refresh the X-Men. And Jonathan Hickman comes knocking at your door and he says he needs you to quietly kind of not cancel, but twilight all the X-Men books going on at the time. So Mr. and Mrs. X and all the Uncanny and whatever teams were going on at that time, they all came to their conclusion. And now it's Hickman for the next 12 weeks on House and Powers. And then they've got this kind of new era of X-Men starting in the fall, which is actually pretty exciting. My personal favorite X-Men team of all time is Excalibur. So I'm very excited to see Teenie Howard is bringing that one back. I didn't catch the name of the artist on that one, but Psylocke is now, or Betsy Braddock is Captain Britain, and she's leading that iteration of Excalibur. So that's really exciting to see. But they are doing big, broad brushstrokes to kind of reinvent the X-Men universe. I mean, you're caught up, right? We've got House 1 and 2 and Powers 1 at the time of this podcast.
Yeah, so, and then I think Powers has 2 and 3 coming out before the next House.
Yeah, and House just dropped a bombshell.
Yes.
Okay, so here's the spoiler. For those of you who are familiar with the X-Men, Moira McTaggart is a mutant, and not only that, she might be one of the most powerful ones that we've seen because of the potential of her ability.
Which is insane. And I was just, because she sits down in the beginning and you're just like, I feel like I know who this is, but I'm not really sure I can remember who it is.
Yeah.
And then they go through the whole entire thing. And when you combine it with, for me at least, since I did the grand design right before or right after actually reading that book, it really helped solidify what was going on. Mm-hmm. I think it's super useful that they provide the timelines for her in the back because it helps sort of straighten things out. It's a little confusing. I'm still a little confusing with the Krakoa and all the everything that's going on, but it's phenomenal. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, and for those of you who may tangentially be familiar, she's kind of one of those supporting characters who pops up every once in a while, but because there's been so many reboots and rewrites in Marvel Comics, you're like, but didn't she die? But also didn't this happen and this happen? But Hickman revealed that he's like, hey, and the fact that it also kind of works with so much of the history of the X-Men, that she actually has the power of reincarnation. And so she has multiple lives through which she's learned how her actions will affect the X-Men. And one of her lives, she was trying to eradicate the X gene, and in another, she was working to protect the X-Men. So it's it's crazy, and we're still only 1/3 of the way through that series. So I'm sure there's so many more bombshells about to be dropped, but it's just this fascinating exercise, because the long and short of it is Xavier is creating a new kind of territory for the mutants to live, and it's Krakoa. And actually, Krakoa is, if you guys want to learn a little bit more about him, you can check out our top 10 plant-powered comic book characters podcast we did a couple weeks ago. Or maybe last week by the time this airs. But it's really cool. So he's like growing seeds to like make this new territory. And the X-Men have tried this before. There was Asteroid M and there was Genosha. And so it's always, where does this grand experiment of the mutants are going to live somewhere else and be safe? And like, how's that going to turn out for them? But it's really exciting.
It is super exciting. And Krakoa in the earlier series too, he's just, he lures the mutants to him and drains their powers. And then you have this whole situation where a lot of the original team from the very beginning doesn't want to go do stuff anymore because they're not quite full powered anymore. And you realize that Krakoa is actually a really powerful mutant and just sort of kind of disappears at that point. So it's really interesting to see what happens. And the combination of Moira with Destiny is really interesting too. And Destiny's just such an interesting character within herself of what's going on. And so to have the interaction of someone who can reincarnate and someone who can see the future is a little bit trippy, but it's kind of, it's super cool to see one. And I have to say, one of my favorite sort of rebirths that Moira had was when she becomes one of the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Yeah. I was super excited. I think that Apocalypse is underrated. I did like the movie. I thought it was kind of fun and enjoyable, but Apocalypse is just such a crazy character, and to have the Four Horsemen, who can be pretty much anybody that he chooses, and then to have her be the right hand trying to destroy things is really, really neat. Yeah.
So that was how she chose to spend one of her lives. And I loved that Destiny said that I only see 10 lives for you, 11, if you make the right choices in the next one. Like, and that's so ominous. And she's on life number 9, I believe, when we get to the comics. I want to jump back to the idea that you brought up, because I love Krakoa, but the idea that some of the mutants weren't fully powered. On the flip side, one of the more interesting developments and literally evolutions was when they introduced secondary mutations for the characters, because a lot of fans didn't like that at first, but some of the secondary mutations now are synonymous with the characters. And then I know recently they did an event where they tried to introduce tertiary mutations with like this thing called the Mother Vine, and that one didn't go over super well. I didn't hear a lot of people talking about it, but many of you may not know, like Emma Frost, her diamond form wasn't originally part of the package, and Beast wasn't originally blue. And so they introduced this secondary mutation that's like, oh, your X gene can continue to change you. And a lot of fans at the time were kind of like, I don't know if I dig that. But now, like when people see Beast not blue, they're like, who is that guy? He looks really weird. Like,
seeing him look like a giant dude with massive hands and feet and no blue, it was a little jarring, like reading that comic. And I think Bobby Drake is an excellent version of that, because he looks like a snowman with no face and boots in the first one, and now you have him as Iceman, where it's more of it's clear. I mean, he's human, or a mutant human, obviously, but it's now clear there's a man under whatever when he changes himself, it's clear that he's still Bobby Drake.
He's like
this
crystalline,
amorphous ball of snow.
And even characters like Jean Grey, Marvel Girl, when she started out, and then the fact that she went through the Phoenix evolution, and that the Phoenix Force is a whole different ballpark, which we could probably, and I know we covered the Phoenix Force a lot in the Jean Grey Then and Now podcast, but like that's a whole other thing, because then you have like the Phoenix Force 5, when like multiple mutants have to bear host to parts of the Phoenix, and it's crazy. And like hand in hand almost with those additional mutations is like clones. Like you can guarantee, because the X-Men, a lot of it is genetic, like so much of their story is genetic, and so then pretty much every X-Men has a clone running around somewhere, which I think is fascinating. And recently, Laura Kinney was actually debunked not debunked, but Tom Taylor in the Adamantium Agenda had Mr. Sinister's DNA kind of research reveal that she's actually the biological daughter of Wolverine, but she herself was cloned, and that made her sister Gabby. Magneto had a clone named Joseph. It's just like everybody's got a clone.
Yeah, most of them seem to have one. There are a few exceptions where I think Juggernaut is probably one of the few exceptions, since he gets his, if I can ever remember what the name of the jewel is called, he gets his powers from the jewel.
The Crimson Gem of Cyttorak.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that is shared. There's a really awesome storyline where Colossus becomes the Juggernaut. And you put two of my favorite characters into one. That would be, if that was ever turned into a statue, I don't think anybody could put that on a table. It would be so big.
Which, for the record, it's not an announcement. It's just wishful thinking.
That's my personal dream. It's definitely not saying anything's outcoming.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you noted earlier in the podcast, Juggernaut's not technically a mutant, and I just have to remember that when I'm talking about him. I'm like, it's so easy to say the Marvel mutants because it's alliterative, but he's not a mutant.
It's still weird to me that he's Professor X's stepbrother.
Yeah.
So it's, and you get to see, at least, like I said, if you're looking for a good overarching history, the Grand Design, and the Grand Design shows you their first interactions, and then he sort of disappears until he comes back, and then you realize who he is.
Yeah. And with clones, also complicated families. I think that's part of the X-Men package, is just having a complicated as hell family. What was I going to say about Juggernaut? Oh, I love his name. I love his the fact that his name is a pun. His name is Cain Marko, which, if you know Bible history, the mark of Cain is like the mark that like he cannot be harmed, and so his name is Cain Marko, and so it kind of plays into the fact that he's an unstoppable force once he gets moving. Like, no one can touch him. Which, when I realized that, I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, but I think that's super funny. Let me see. I've got so many notes here. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface on films. Do you want to talk about the X-Men films a little bit?
Sure. I was really super excited when they came out with the first ones. It was really great to see some of your characters. Now, I think all of us have our perfect idea in our head, and maybe it doesn't quite reflect that, but that doesn't mean they're not good movies. Mm-hmm. I think, in my opinion, a lot of the trouble with some of the movies today is people we're so invested, and there's nothing wrong with being invested, but we have to understand also, I try and take them as entertainment first.
Yeah.
Because I think if, not that I haven't ever yelled at a movie screen about something, but I want to enjoy what I enjoy the most. So I'm going to try and just focus on the fact that even if it's not everything perfect in my mind, it's still a great storytelling experience to sit through. And I always, Rogue is a favorite of mine. I was thrilled with Hugh Jackman as Wolverine.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I'm pretty much a big fan of most of all of those people. So it's great. And I love the interaction between Sabretooth and Wolverine. That's also a really great one to see, especially their whole storyline, which they do in one of the movies. I'll get all the names of which one comes first wrong because I'm really terrible with things like that. But I enjoyed all of them. I own a great deal of them. I mean, Logan was fantastic.
Logan, and that is a great, because that story I know there was Old Man Logan, but really that story was not adapted in that way. But the idea that this is still part of that universe, and we get to see like a interesting alternate future that I just think it left on such a hopeful note. I know it was super sad to see Logan die, but like the idea that, first of all, you got this tiny adorable X-23 who's like, I would follow her into battle anywhere. But you've got the next generation of mutants, but you've also got the idea of the kids growing up with the X-Men as like a mythological hero kind of thing. And it's like, oh, the X-Men will save us. Like, we've got the comics, like this is that thing. And that was such a fascinating like thought experiment for that film universe. Like when they acknowledge the fact that the heroes do exist in that universe and become symbols, and for some people they're still hated mutants and people are afraid of them. But then for other people like that, they're a symbol of hope.
They always say that, legends have some truth in history. And for that specific thing with the kids, like, you're in my comic book. Mm-hmm. You're real. So part of this has to be real. And, we can do all these great things. I think it's really hopeful for the kids to see, oh, okay, well, it's not in that universe specifically. It's not just a comic book. It's some of this is true. You're telling me some of this is true. And I know that's you. So stop trying to tell me that you didn't do stuff.
Yeah, because it really also plays into the idea that the X-Men at first, I think when they've always been a symbol for the underdog and the marginalized and the underrepresented voice. But like, I think especially as time has gone on and our society has evolved and also devolved in some ways, like, that part of the story in the movie, it's also the representation, because it's like, I'm like the little kids who are like, I'm also a mutant and I see you as like as a touchstone. And so while, as far as I know, the X-Men aren't real in our universe, I've seen some people with some weird uncanny abilities that I'm like, that might be a mutant power. It's not like a Wolverine status mutant power, but like, okay, there might be X-Men out there. But to feel that representation, and I think the X-Men have been great characters for that, just across the board, because that's what they stand for. And then I think not on the flip side, but in that same vein of like taking very underappreciated characters, I think the Deadpool movies, I'm one of those people who I'm like, if someone comes into the comic book store that I work at and asks me if we've got New Mutants 98, like, one more time, I'm gonna like pitch myself through the window. So I was a little like hesitant. I was like, okay, like, really, like Deadpool. But those movies, speaking of just wanting to have fun, like, those are some of the most uproarious movies. They do a great job with the greatly reduced cast of X-Men that they get to have. Like, the fact that they pulled out all those X-Force, like, deep cut, like, Shatterstar, Zeitgeist. And Zeitgeist is the Ecstatics. So like, that was crazy. But the fact that they were like, okay, we're not the A-team top string X-Men. We're going to do what we can with that. Negasonic Teenage Warhead, Angel Dust, like, all these characters that it's like, those are not even if I asked you to think of a cool X-Men and I said, okay, not that one, try again, not that one, like, you wouldn't even get to those guys by like the 5th or 6th go around.
Well, and what I also like is some of the ones that are sort of introduced as the quote unquote villains, like Emma Frost, and I had another really good one in my head. They'll come back to you. Yeah. So they'll have them as the Dark X-Men, or they'll have them as, because she's called the White Queen, and they have that whole sort of chess set of bad people.
Hellfire Club.
There we go. I was like, I know this word. It's just escaping me right now. So she starts in the Hellfire Club, and then they add some of the mutants that we know very, very well. Some of them stay on the side of evil, so to speak, but some of them come around. And then you have the mutants like Namor, who show up in both the Dark X-Men and in the actual X-Men as well, and throughout the Marvel Universe. Mm-hmm. So it's really great that they can sort of pull from everywhere, and there have always been all types. Mm-hmm. It's, Aurora Monroe, there's always been someone from somewhere all across the world. And I think that's what's one of the most unique things. Is a lot of in my opinion, a lot of the other universes and worlds and everything, they'll introduce them, but they weren't there necessarily to begin with.
Yeah.
Thunderbird is there from the beginning. Storm is there from the beginning. It was just like, well, we're going to put these people in there, and this is what they do, and it was awesome.
Yeah, and another thing that I really like is because sometimes when you're in the Marvel universe, and especially watching the Marvel cinematic movies, you're like, oh my God, poor New York, like it's all happening right here. But the comics have also done a really great job recently of introducing the idea that there are mutants everywhere. Because Tom Taylor and Mohammed Asrar did X-Men Red with Jean Grey leading the team, and that was a really, really kind of international team. They had a Wakandan mutant, and then they had a mutant from India, and then they had X-23 and her sister Gabby, who was going by Honey Badger. And so it is this idea that the mutant identity and even the mutant prejudice against mutants is everywhere in the Marvel universe. And so you can have those really globe-trotting stories Again, my favorite team is Excalibur, and so like you've got that in like kind of the UK division, strangeness going on, fighting aliens like the TechNet. And I love that kind of idea that it is a global, and sometimes it's even in outer space. Like, I mean, once you get into the space and the Shi'ar stuff, I get a little like, whoa, with the X-Men, but it's just, I like that the idea that it's not just like, oh, it's another 5 boroughs in New York that are getting attacked again, and who's going to step up and fix that. Like, it is a kind of a big experience.
It is a big experience. You also have the Swashbucklers, like that whole series, which I'm really hoping that they'll get a lot of those characters will get looped back in because they're really fun.
Yeah, like the upcoming Marauders book. I've been so bad about remembering the artists, and I'm so sorry. I will do my penance for that. But I know Jerry Duggan's writing it, and Russell Dodderman is doing the covers for the upcoming Marauders series, and that'll be nice to see. I know that one's fun because Emma Frost is like funding their venture from Frost Enterprises, and it's like that's kind of nefarious, and I want to see where that's going. But yeah, and you brought up the Hellfire Club. I just wanted to touch on that briefly, that like that's also a huge part of the Dark Phoenix saga, which unfortunately is one of the most beloved X-Men stories that never gets told completely right. And I think because a lot of people leave out the Hellfire Club, like they in the very short-lived Fox series, The Gifted, which Gifted was a nice code word for mutant, they had the Hellfire Club, and they actually had the Stepford Cuckoos, or they called them the Frost Sisters. I don't think they necessarily called them the Cuckoos in the series. But yeah, I know that the X-Men the Animated Series did the Dark Phoenix saga really well, but a lot of these other places they don't get into that part of the mythos, which I think I love the Hellfire Club so much.
Well, that's what's also so exciting about Disney having acquired Fox is what they are able to do now with the movies. And it's not to take anything away from the movies that have been, but the movies that could be are just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And to explore really, because I think a lot of people get confused with the Dark Phoenix, and when you sort of throw in the two of the embodiments in the same movie, I think it's a little confusing if you don't know the backstory and sort of what's going on and why why it's worth fighting over. And I think that, Jean Grey and her different Phoenix transformations are all really unique. The Phoenix in the red is completely different than the Phoenix in the green. And there are reasons for both of them. And I think that they could do something really amazing just with that whole separate story too, with the Shi'ar and all that would be amazing because it's a whole different race that sort of gets touched on a lot, but there's a lot you could do with them as well. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, at this point in time, there are no definite announcements from Marvel about what's coming, but at the absolute bombshell Hall H panel at Comic-Con this last year, Kevin Feige announced the slate up through like 2022 or 2021, and he said, and we didn't even get to touch on the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and all these guys, and so it'll be a few years before we get to see the mutants in action, but I do agree that with the potential there, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if they choose to fold in Deadpool. I mean, he was such a popular character. Of course, I'm sure we're going to see Wolverine. I know they said if any of the characters from the previous films that they did just acquire come into it, they're going to be doing a total recasting. But I think not only do they have a chance to really give us some definitive versions of characters like Storm and maybe Jean Grey and maybe Gambit and Rogue and stuff like that, I think that what Marvel has exceeded at with names like Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man, taking those characters who are not the A-listers, they don't have to go as far down as like Zeitgeist and Bedlam where Deadpool did, but you can bring in some of those middle tier X-Men characters and give them a chance, like Generation X and the New Mutants. I know the New Mutants film is kind of in hot water right now, but those kinds of characters who they're in the teams, they're all around. I mean, there's nothing that special effects wizards can't do at this point, I'm concerned, but just the
the limitless potential, I think, to realize these characters on screen is really exciting, and I can't wait to see what they announce.
Well, and in the breadth of just like all of the different X-Men, all of the different mutants, they appear in almost all of the different universes. Whether it's the first mutant or whether it's, our favorites, they interact with Black Panther, they interact with the Fantastic Four. There are so many opportunities to bring in some of the lesser known characters who are actually throughout a lot of the story arcs. I will always harp on Namor because he is my absolute favorite and technically the first mutant, as he's portrayed and said by Marvel in many of the comics, and actually predates Marvel Comics itself. But it's, they have opportunities to bring in characters like those who interact with so many others.
Yeah.
And, the movies have been great, but I'm super stoked for the Fantastic Four show. I'm really excited to see what they do with everything, not just the X-Men. You really open it up to everyone, and to be able to see what the X-Men do, who they choose to have them interact with, what other characters they bring in, because they can interact with the Avengers. They do fairly often in the comics as well. So there are so many different opportunities to have these beloved characters from all story arcs interact.
Yeah, and I think Marvel's in a really good spot right now that the Infinity Saga has kind of closed off, and the first film up for their next slate is going to be a prequel with Black Widow. They have some smart opportunities to make it organic and not just. I would be surprised if they did the mutants have been here the whole time, we just never acknowledged them. I almost think they're going to more organically step it forward from like, hey, like, we'll probably explore the results of the snap, and maybe this created some. I mean, we could speculate all day long, but I think it would be smarter of them not to say, oh, the X-Men were here the whole time, you just never heard about them, but instead give an organic reason as to why they are just now appearing in the universe, and from that you could have limitless potential of like they're appearing everywhere, and we have to do something and organize a school. And in the talking of who interacts with who, I mean, the last thing I have to bring up that I just thought was the most interesting, because of the era in which I started reading the comics, and they didn't really have they didn't have the rights to the X-Men for film, and they didn't really want to push the comics because there were X books happening. The Inhumans, I think it was really interesting that was and the Inhumans have been around for a while, not as long as the X-Men, but the fact that was kind of the alternative of like, oh, like they can manifest weird powers like the Terrigenesis, and like, but the fact that they then said, and they keyed a whole event around it, that X-Men and the Inhumans can't coexist. Because I mean, the whole deal for the X-Men is, can the X-Men and humans coexist? But the fact that they said the Inhumans, literally the process by which an Inhuman is activated, with the Terrigen Mist, that is toxic to the X-Men and will kill them. And I would be curious to know if the Inhumans had been given a warmer reception by fans, if Marvel would have played them up a little more. I mean, we do have some fantastic ones who stuck around, like Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, and Moon Girl, and Devil Dinosaur. But they did a whole event where it was like it was Inhumans versus X-Men, and the X-Men were like, hey, like you guys are literally killing us because of the Terrigen clouds. And then Medusa was like, okay, well, we'll destroy the last of the Terrigen clouds, so no new Inhumans will be made. I almost wonder if that was Marvel saying, okay, guys, like we get it. You really want the X-Men back. We'll stop making new Inhumans. Because it was weird. It became a like, hey, could these be your alternative to the X-Men? And people were like, no, because you can't replace the X-Men. And the X-Men are underdogs, whereas the Inhumans, they're also a genetic experiment from the Kree. And so they have that underdog potential, but for some reason they just didn't take as popularly as the X-Men.
I think, I don't know as much about the Inhumans, although I'm a big fan of Lockjaw. Mainly because I have a bulldog and he's adorable. So, but I think the problem is the X-Men are so popular that you really, if they were perceived by anyone as, okay, this is their replacement, as you were saying, you just can't.
Yeah.
Like they're the X-Men. It's whether you love or hate the characters, they're the X-Men. Yeah. And, it's really interesting to see what various people think about various characters. There are whole like articles about, I saw one because Gambit's one of my favorite, and it's 15 reasons why Gambit is the worst. Now, it's really actually pretty funny to read because they're not really wrong with what they're saying, but to me, those are sort of what make him the best.
Well, and we all know that Professor Xavier is a jerk, and deep cut reference. And I mean, I always laugh when I see Scott Summers because we have someone in the office who says that Scott Summers is one of the best X-Men villains because he's not, for those who genuinely don't know, he's one of the teammates. But some of his behaviors is just like, come on, Scott, come on. But yeah, I mean,
and I think that's what's great about the X-Men too is they all have the duality. Like it's not like they're just good or just bad, or Cyclops is always sometimes he's just totally fine, and sometimes you're like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's not like you're a mutant, so you're always right because people don't like you, but you're fighting for your rights. Like sometimes you're wrong, dude. Like.
Yeah, and then the X-Men Extermination series is a whole other ball game, which is really interesting to see, and it's really neat to see how they do all these different story arcs. So I'm really, while it was kind of sad to see those end, I sort of came through with the comics starting really with the wedding of Kitty Pryde and Colossus, because Colossus is one of my favorites. I saw the cover and I was like, I need this. And I came home and my husband had it on the bed. And I was like, yeah, it's okay. And so then it was the whole hunt for, the X-Men Gold and then, being like, oh my gosh, I forgot about this. And then he brought me one of his favorite X-Men that he remembers, which is sort of, it's you can find it in a trade paperback. I don't remember exactly. I think it's called Victims. And it's got Wolverine and Gambit. And basically, from my understanding, Gambit, and I need to read it, but Gambit is in London and they're sort of looking for the next Jack the Ripper and they think it's Wolverine. And so it's kind of that story, and it's like the creativity that they've gotten with a lot of these older, lesser known stories is really amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it is just a testament to the idea that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee came up with, that this idea of mutants is infinitely mutable and changeable. So I think we're winding down a little bit now, but we do always like to give people kind of a recommendation. So just as your Katie's personal recs for like any X-Men comic story movie that you want people to check out if they're looking to know a little bit more about the X-Men.
Then I would absolutely have to suggest The Grand Design because as I said, it's a 6-comic series, 2 comics each of the sets. And it gives you an overarching understanding of the universe and everything sort of the X-Men have gone through. So if you're a little confused about things that you may have seen in the movies and don't quite understand, they definitely reference the Phoenix Force quite a bit because it's such a huge central part of what goes on. So I think it'll give you a really great reference point to jump in. And if you turn to the back and you're like, okay, I want this story arc, you'll be able to find it. It tells you where.
Awesome. I think for me, of course, I think anyone should go back and give X-Men the Animated Series a rewatch. It is now over 25 years old. There's also a great book called Previously on X-Men that Eric and Julia Lewald, the showrunners, and then a number of the writers like Len Uly, Larry Houston, who's one of the production designers, they put together this really kind of ultimate retrospective on that animated series, which was so formative for a lot of people. I mean, I know that series inspired some of my favorite comic book artists. I'm gonna give a shout out to Russell Dodderman, who's now doing covers on the Marauders book, but like he shared on his Instagram these drawings that he did in like 95 of like Jean Grey, and then like the Jean Grey he was professionally paid to draw in 2017. And then I think there's so many X-Men books. If you're listening currently, check out House of X and Powers of 10 because those are mind-boggling. But for anyone who's kind of like wondering what the relevance is of X-Men in the modern age, I highly, highly recommend X-Men Red by Tom Taylor and Mohammed Asrar. That one was really, I think it was only 11 issues, but it was just a really good series that got to the heart of the empathy and the understanding for other identities that the X-Men has always strived for, because the X-Men at the end of the day are still, as much as we love them and champion them in their own universe, they are the ultimate underdogs. If you enjoyed this episode of Then and Now, be sure to check out our back catalog of dozens of discussions on all your favorite pop culture characters and fandoms. If you have feedback or suggestions for future episodes, be sure to email us at podcast@sideshow.com. We appreciate your continued support. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to let your geek side show. Do you enjoy listening to Then and Now? We We are proud to bring you pop culture content completely ad-free, but that doesn't mean we don't need your support to help keep us going. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting platform and help spread the word about our podcast. We welcome fan feedback. Email us at podcasts@sideshow.com with your thoughts and suggestions for how we can make our shows even better. Plus, tune in for our full network of pop culture podcasts. See if your fan favorites make the cut in the Geek Culture Countdown, a bi-weekly podcast featuring pop culture top 10 lists. Hear exclusive interviews with celebrities and pop culture industry leaders as they let their geek side show in Look Who Showed Up. Join comedian Jeff May and his special guests as they discuss anything and everything in Sideshow's Sideshow. Then get all the latest pop culture news with our daily briefing, a 2-minute breakdown of the biggest geek headlines perfect for your Alexa or Google News briefings. We wouldn't exist without your continued support. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to let your geek side show.